All right. That was some of the tracks on our amazing Breakup with Zenith album from 2021, I believe, with amazing lyrics by Kate. Um, all right, are we good? We're recording. We're rolling. Cool. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for this rainy evening of comment and testimony writing. Wouldn't want to be anywhere else tonight than with you all. So glad you can be here. And hello to all of our friends who are watching a recording of this at another time. We're glad you can watch this as well. My name is Dineen. I'm with 350 PDX. We have an awesome slate of folks here tonight who will be talking with us, our movement experts, about this issue and about how we can frame our comments and our testimony to the DEQ about why the agency should deny the upcoming air quality permit for Zenith Energy that's currently under review. This event this evening is also part of our ongoing Rumble on the River community forums, which have been, this is technically the 18th Rumble. And these are some of the many groups who have been part of our series over the past couple of years. And all these groups make this work possible. And we thank all of them for sponsoring this series and for helping us get the word out and building this movement with us. I also just want to start this off by I love this photo, and it just like really captures the love of our community and our movement and our campaign, and just really wanted to start off with that tonight because yeah, shit is kind of hard right now. It's a bit of an understatement. And I just want folks to know that, like, however you're coming to this workshop tonight is welcome. You may be feeling really angry and frustrated and scared or numb and or maybe excited about some of our local results and confused about all these mix of emotions. And all of that is welcome. And yeah, thank you for like bringing your full self to this work that we do together. And you don't have to like mask how you're feeling about all of this. And just appreciative for all the work that you all are doing to like stay hopeful in this moment that we're in. And I think, speaking for myself and for probably a lot of us on this call too, we're really not just mourning the election results, but also a dear friend in our community right now, Bob Salinger, which has been really heavy on our hearts the past couple of weeks since we learned that devastating and shocking news about losing Bob. And I wanted to also bring that in and let people know they are not alone in feeling the immense loss and grief of that. And the wonderful Tributary Alliance, just a coalition that we're all a part of, is organizing a remembrance event for Bob that you all are invited to. It's on Saturday, November 23rd at 2 in the afternoon at Green Acres, which is just next to Cathedral Park, if you haven't been. And yeah, just really wanted to extend that invitation to you all, that there's a time where we can all be together in person to talk about Bob and the impact that he had on us and all of our work together. and just be together. So, and in the spirit of Bob and, rolling up our sleeves and getting to work, that's what we're doing here tonight too. So we're doing it for Bob. Before we dive in to really talk about the juicy info that we want to include in our comments and in our testimony, just want to remind everyone that one of the biggest moment within this comment period from now until December 16th is coming up next week on Tuesday, where it's the only in-person public hearing that the DEQ is holding about this issue. And so it's our only moment to show the power of our movement in person, and to testify on the record. And so this is a crucial moment. We really hope all of you are joining us. We're planning an awesome event, a rally with a brass band, with pizza, with warm drinks, with great speakers. You're going to get to hear from a couple of our newly elected city council members. It's going to be an awesome event at University of Portland. Please don't miss it. We'll drop the RSVP link in the chat. And this is what we're thinking about when we're thinking about writing our testimony. We will also have one more opportunity on December 4th to testify on the record to the DEQ, and that will just be on Zoom. So there will be 2 opportunities to share your testimony. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the first of our 3 amazing speakers. Starting us off is Kate Murphy with Columbia Riverkeeper, who has been fighting Zenith alongside us for this entire time. And we have a lot we can learn from Kate. So I'll pass it over to her.
Thank you, Dineen, and thanks everybody for showing up tonight. I know that a lot of folks are eager to participate in this comment period with Zenith, and we hope tonight is helpful to kind of talk through some of the talking points we're suggesting that folks use and bring up with Zenith. I'm not going to go into background too much because we have a lot of that information online, but we're going to talk through a lot of the talking points and kind of give some context for what's going on. And then after that, I'll pass to Mary to cover the legal side of things. Okay, let's go to the next slide, Dineen, please. So when we think about these new proposals for things and permit modifications or new permits, we really want regulators to be asking the question, will this really result in a real world reduction of harm in our communities? And if the answer is no, we really don't want them to have to go any further than that. When it comes to Zenith, the answer to that question is no. And a lot of what has driven this permitting process is the focus on the reduction of allowable emissions, meaning they're reducing the ceiling for how many emissions that Zenith can put out. But Zenith was never really close to that ceiling in the first place. It was an inherited permit. And so when you look at the actual on-site emissions at the facility, what we see is not a big improvement like they've kind of greenwashed it to be. And what that means for us is that we're going to see more harmful pollution. We're going to see more explosive trains coming all along the transportation route. We're going to see the continued handling of fossil fuels, and we're going to see that Zenith's plan is actually likely to bring more harm to already overburdened communities. Next slide, please. So what we found when we looked into Zenith's air contaminant discharge permit application, that's what ACDP means, that's the air permit that they're applying for. What we found Zenith was actually asking from the state was an expansion of operations. We saw that they are planning or proposing in their numbers to increase the amount of crude oil throughput. That's the amount of product going through the facility up until 2027, when they've agreed with the city to stop handling crude oil. They will continue to ship fossil fuels after they stop handling crude. So Zenith, let's be very clear, Zenith is still a fossil fuel company. They've just added renewals. It's like I've said before, if a candy store starts also selling carrots, it's still a candy store, right? So we want to be sure to be clear that Zenith is a fossil fuel company. They have proposed shipping significant quantities of what's called renewable naphtha, which is technically, according to the definition of, it's not from petroleum feedstock, is how they're defining renewables. So that's a really broad definition that doesn't really speak to the potential harms that these products can bring into communities. So renewable naphtha in particular shares a lot of the same risks as crude oil and diesel. It's harmful to aquatic life. It's harmful to humans. It has a risk of risks of spills, accidents, and explosions. In addition, the renewable naphtha, it's similar in consistency chemically to gasoline, and so it adds the higher risk of flashback events where you have vapors that can travel low to the ground to an ignition source, and then it flashes back. That's not something we want happening anywhere, particularly at the CEI hub where we're storing 90% of Oregon's fuel. So we're also going to see an increase in harmful pollution. And along with this increase, we'll see an increase in all the types of traffic that they use to transport the fuel. So rail traffic, marine tankers, and trucks. Next slide, please. So when we look at the concerns around public safety and health and the environment with the Zenith facility, what we see is there's a number of risks, and they range from exposures to toxic and carcinogenic chemicals that get released all throughout the transport process and the handling and storing process. There's what's called fugitive emissions that just kind of leak throughout the entire system regularly. And there's also the risks of accidents, spills, explosions. We've seen that regularly. We just saw last week, I think it was, a diesel spill into the Columbia River of 650 gallons. When it's just really not a good product to be handling, and particularly because Zenith is located at the CEI hub, which many of us knows in a liquefaction zone. That means when there's an earthquake, the consistency of that land that those tanks are on is going to turn essentially to like cake batter. And that's not a good solid foundation for again, like storing that massive quantity of fuel there. So Zenith's operations really do have the potential to be catastrophic for both the Willamette and Lower Columbia River. Next slide, please. So I want to be really clear, I alluded to this earlier, but renewable fuels are still potentially really dangerous. So like I said, it's renewable in this sense is it's not petroleum-based feedstock, so they'll use other types of feedstock. And so we see that the renewable fuels are often chemically consistent with conventional fuels, so that they share a lot of the same risks that we talked about. And I mentioned that renewable naphtha adds some additional harm. So imagine they're talking about essentially a one-to-one transition from the crude oil numbers in 2022, I think, to renewable naphtha numbers. So they're talking about, we could potentially be seeing unit trains with 100 cars of explosive renewable naphtha. So the other thing that's worth mentioning is that now that these renewable fuels are being, handled more, we're getting some data back about spills. And what's the data is showing is that when you see these blended fuels end up spilling into the water, oftentimes they'll separate when they hit the water, and it requires multiple types of cleanup. So we've all seen kind of like the attempt when something spills in the river, and you could look it up from last week, where they throw out a boom, often it's like 5 hours later, they get the boom out and it's just kind of floating there, trying to catch stuff floating on the surface. But the blended fuels separate when they hit the water. So you need the floating cleanup, but you also need something to clean up the fuels that sink into the water column. And that, like, I would challenge anyone to name one spot along the entire transportation route that is prepared to do a cleanup like that. Next slide, please. So I also want to be really clear that this is an expansion of a fossil fuel facility. So we talked about they're adding renewables, but they're also still handling fossil fuels after they transition off of crude oil. So the amount of product that they're handling at the facility, they're going to continue increasing that. And DEQ has stated, and this is confusing because, people will say, well, what about, I thought they had to switch to renewables. So Zenith is only committed to stopping crude. And DEQ has said in the air permit, or in the FAQ actually about the air permit, that there's nothing preventing Zenith from increasing the handling of fossil fuels with the existing infrastructure. Only the new infrastructure they're proposing is what they're on the hook for using for exclusively renewables. Next slide, please. So we recently shared some research that we've done, and I think Dineen might have a link that you can put in the chat for folks to reference. So we decided to figure out how many violations Zenith had actually committed over the years, and what we found was pretty alarming. So we have a document that kind of lays out all of these violations, but in a nutshell, they've racked up nearly 20 violations with DEQ over the years. And essentially it shows the story of a company that has almost never been in compliance since they've been operating here. And they have, the range of violations. Some is kind of, more minor, and other violations like storing the wrong type of fuel in fixed roof tanks can create an additional hazard for public health and safety. And in addition to that, one of the most shocking violations that we found that I'm about to talk about is that Zenith has illegally expanded their fossil fuel facility already. Next slide, please. So in April of 2021, and we just found out this out in the last couple of months, Zenith illegally expanded its fossil fuel operations, and they did that by adding new infrastructure. They added a flange valve and a section of pipe, and they did welding and hooked up to an existing pipeline that goes from their facility to the McCall oil facility. So they basically hooked up to the McCall oil dock to add the ability to transload fuels at that dock. And after they hooked up, they started handling fossil fuels. So they handled some renewable diesel, and they also handled standard conventional diesel. At the same time, they were handling this without any authorization through this pipe. They were assuring the regulators that they would only be using this new infrastructure for renewables, and this pipe that they are using and have been using since 2021 is part of that infrastructure that they're referencing. So this illegal use of the dock went undetected by DEQ for about 2.5 years, and then they discovered it at the beginning of this year. And instead of issuing any type of penalty for illegally expanding their fossil fuel operations, DEQ has actually written the illegally accessed dock into Zenith's draft air. Next slide, please. I'm going to try and hurry up a little because I know we're pushing time. But okay, so I want to point out that the permits that Zenith got with the city were obtained. One could argue they were obtained under false pretenses. So we already have heard the story about the city auditor found that Zenith participated in illegal lobbying in order to get their land use compatibility statement. But what we also realized once we saw that they had expanded to use the McCall dock was that while they were applying for their land use compatibility statement to use this infrastructure for only renewables, and while they applied for their Greenway review to put 3 pipes under Front Avenue, they were already using that dock for fossil fuels. So they did not, as far as we know, we haven't seen any evidence that they informed the city about that to inform those permit applications. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's an issue about enforceability that we're concerned about because for the first time, as far as I know, the city has issued a land use compatibility statement that has special conditions. So that means that anything that's not explicitly written into DEQ's air permit, but is in the land use compatibility statement, the city's on the hook for enforcing any of that. And that's a concern because, I mean, we don't know exactly what that means, frankly. And the city, there's no evidence really that the city has capacity to do any type of regulation on Zenith's operations, let alone setting a precedent for other facilities to try and set up land use permits with special conditions that the city's on the hook for regulating and enforcing. Next slide, please. Okay, this is my last slide, and I just want to point out DEQ has a duty to use its full authority. They have authority to deny the permit. They have authority to review the legality of the LUCs. There's been a broad public outreach about this, and it's worth pointing out that DEQ is starting to permit in the same way they've been permitting conventional fuels. They're starting to permit these emerging fuels without first stopping and looking at the regulatory language and evolving the protective public health and safety and environmental language prior to permitting these emerging fuels. So we really need to push on DEQ to adjust their regulatory language to be protective before they start permitting new fuels like this. So we really want to encourage everyone to put pressure on DEQ. They always talk about the limits and boundaries they have. They talk about it all the time. And I've never heard them say, we know this because we were told no, we were being too protective of community. So what I want to encourage folks to say is not just listen to those limitations, because there's a space between where DEQ is operating and the edges of their authority. And we want to try and push them outside of where they are in closer to those edges. So anyway, I'm sure folks have lots of questions. I'm going to stop talking. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kate. That was great. We are going to do questions at the end. So next we're going to turn it over. Oh, we had one more great slide from Kate.
Right. I forgot I had one more slide, but I think I'm done. I'm done. But I do love that picture. We will be persistent as the glorious weeds.
I love it. That's what we do. Now we're going to get to hear from our wonderful Mary Stites from the Northwest Environmental Defense Center. And Mary will go a little more into the weeds. So great transition. Okay.
Yes, awesome. Thank you. Thank you all for letting me be here tonight. I'm so grateful to be a part of this coalition and doing this work with you all. And can everyone hear me? I guess someone would have said, okay, perfect. I do want to make the one disclosure that please don't interpret this as legal advice, but I am going to walk you all kind of through where we are on the specific permit as it relates to Zenith's entire operations. Kate just wonderfully laid out, all that is wrong in terms of environmental, public health, corporate accountability. The list goes on. All that is wrong with this facility. I'm going to try to frame things for what this comment period is about and how we can connect those wrongs to the specific hooks that will hopefully resonate with DEQ. So where we're at right now, we are talking about the Federal Clean Air Act. Sorry, my slides are really boring, and there's a lot of words and a lot of boring words, if you will. So I apologize that they will not be as engaging, but hopefully this strikes a nerve with y'all. So the Clean Air Act is our federal law that regulates air emissions from what's called a stationary source. And the purpose of this law is to protect and enhance the quality of the nation's air resources so as to promote public health and welfare, and the productive capacity of its population, and to encourage regional air pollution prevention programs. And then I've included the legal sites if, for whatever reason, you want to go read those if you're having a hard time falling asleep. And then in that, what is important to us is that the Clean Air regulates what's called criteria pollutants, which we'll talk about later, and then hazardous air pollutants. And this is all to protect ambient air quality and public health. What is going to be relevant, particularly to Zenith, is in this statutory mandate is a requirement to regulate based on whether or not a facility is a major source or a minor source. So we'll talk about that on this in a couple of slides. But basically, there's different scales that impart different regulations and different obligations. And Zenith kind of finds itself in a little bit of a weird posture. So that's the Clean Air Act. In theory, it's supposed to protect us. Next slide, please. Okay, and so under the Clean Air Act, the Oregon DEQ, which is how DEQ has entered the discussion, if you will, Oregon DEQ has their own implementing regulations that are supposed to basically create state law from this federal law. And so the Oregon state implementation policy is to, quote, restore and maintain the quality of our air resources, and to make sure that it is in a condition as free from air pollution as practicable and consistent with the overall public health and welfare of the state. And so I highlight this to note that what is going on at the Zenith facility is contrary to this policy. And that's something to highlight in your comments, because we know that this facility is not going to restore, much less maintain, the quality of our air resources in the state. But I just wanted to give that kind of statutory context. So next slide. So something that I wanted to pinpoint on this specific permit is kind of the confusion that I myself have endured. But everyone has heard about this Title V permit. And Title V is a program under the Federal Clean Air Act that Oregon has to implement, right? And so Title V permits, they regulate what's called a major source of air pollutants. And a major source can occur in one of two ways. So a major source can occur because the source has the potential to emit over 100 tons of any criteria pollutant, or because they have the potential to emit 25 tons of what's called a hazardous air pollutant. So stepping back, a major pollutant, from a criteria standpoint, is any source that will pollute more than 100 tons of particulate matter, ozone, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, or lead. So those are what's called the criteria pollutants. Those are the pollutants that you walk out the door and you say, oh my God, the air quality looks so bad. Should I go outside? That could occur because of high concentrations of particulate matter or ozone, or God forbid, lead. The other way that you can be a major source is because you emit hazardous air pollutants. Those are not ones that we see typically with the naked eye. And there's 188 of them, including benzene, which is found in gasoline, but there's a much lower threshold, and that's 25 tons per year of what's declared a hazardous air pollutant. And I'm happy to answer questions on that if we're kind of in the weeds again, as Dineen articulated, but I just want everyone to understand that there's this Title V permit for what the EPA basically declares as a really big source for these two kinds of pollutants, criteria and hazardous. Next slide. So here we are with Zenith's air permit, and one of the multitude of procedural issues that plagues this specific permit is the fact that Zenith has been regulated for the past 10 plus years as a major source, which some would impart more stringent regulations. But the reason that they have been implemented or regulated as a major source is because they have been operating under the permit that was issued to an asphalt facility. And for anyone that's new here, Zenith is not producing asphalt. So good question, Michael. 100 tons per year. So it starts at the calendar year. But yeah, stepping back, Zenith is not an asphalt refinery. They have had a permit that regulates asphalt, which they obviously don't do. Now, under their new permit, they have applied to not be regulated as an asphalt refinery, and they will be a minor source, which requires way less stringent monitoring and, I guess, control technology for their air emissions. That's a story for a different day, but they still have a really huge emissions profile, and this will be relevant for something we talk about later. but this whole distinction between them being a major source versus a minor source is because they have just had the wrong permit for the entire, length of their operation. So next slide. So I've just included, this is pulled directly from their draft permit, and this is their emissions limits profile for, as we talked about before, their criteria pollutants. So these are the ambient air quality standards. So when you walk outside, like, is it hazy? Oh, that's usually particulate matter, XYZ. So these are the things we can kind of perceive with the naked eye. As you can see, they have pretty relatively high emissions for nitrous oxides, carbon monoxide, VOCs, and greenhouse gases. So these are the criteria pollutants. And if you remember what we talked about before, that is the 100 tons per year threshold. So as you can see, they're below 30, so they are not, quote unquote, a major source for the criteria pollutants. And the next slide. And then here is their list for the hazardous air pollutants. And still, they are well below what would qualify them as a hazardous air pollutant major source. But as you can still see, that's still over 10 tons per year of hazardous air pollutants, which is not for nothing. Next slide. So a little comment writing tip that I would plug for y'all right now is you can see on the VOC, the volatile organic compound emissions limit, something that DEQ is applauding is that VOCs are going to be significantly reduced because their current permit that they have right now allows for almost 180 tons per year. Again, that's the asphalt refinery permit. Allows for that emissions profile, and what they're applying for now is just under 40 tons per year. And DEQ's like, yeah, less VOCs, which sure, that is a good thing to have less volatile organic compounds being emitted into our airshed, but that is all because Zenith has been regulated under the wrong permit, and it's been regulated under a completely different industrial code that shouldn't have been applicable, and that's not something that someone should be applauding them for, quote unquote, reducing their emissions profiles. So if you really want to get mad about something, if you have nothing else to get mad at, might I plug this? Next slide. And I just want to, I know I've thrown at y'all like a ton of information. I just want to kind of highlight some of the pollutants of concern and things that might be worth elevating to DEQ, especially as they pertain to the comment period at issue. There's a huge carbon monoxide emissions profile, and that, is known for having various health effects associated with basically your respiratory capacity. Same with VOCs. And y'all know the deal on greenhouse gases. So allowing increases in greenhouse gas emissions, we don't need that. Same with VOCs and carbon monoxides. And these are, again, the criteria pollutants that affect the ambient air quality. And you can go and look at the recording, but I've included what's called the Federal Register citation. So basically, when the EPA listed these pollutants as pollutants of concern, this is the EPA's own information on how these emissions of these pollutants affect people. So it's a really great thing to cite if you're wondering how carbon monoxide and VOCs and greenhouse gases affect your own personal health and community well-being. That's a really great resource. So that's why I highlighted it. And for the purposes of writing a comment saying, I'm concerned about increases in carbon monoxide because it's going to, result with decreased oxygen availability for my critical tissues and organs. So that's that comment writing tip, if you will. Next slide. Thank you, Dineen. And then the same kind of rhetoric as it pertains to hazardous air pollutants. So we have benzene and ethylbenzene and toluene, which are just a few of the hazardous air pollutants that Zenith in their storage authorization they're allowed to emit. And we know that benzene has a lot of short-term exposure that results in drowsiness and dizziness and headaches and other respiratory irritation. Ethylbenzene also results in more respiratory irritation. We don't know what the long-term effects to that exposure are, and same with toluene. That has really pretty articulable impacts to your central nervous system functioning. And again, this is all from EPA data that articulates how these hazardous air pollutants affect human health. So I just pulled these again to note that when you're looking at your comments and trying to urge DEQ saying an increase in benzene is unacceptable because it will cause these other health effects. So next slide. And then DEQ's authority to deny the ACDP. There's all of these like kind of practical and in turn regulatory unknowns that pertain to quote unquote renewable fuels. So renewable fuels is such a vague term. It can impart or implicate so many different feedstocks that we don't really know that DEQ has the requisite information to ensure that the handling of these feedstocks is going to, and these fuels is going to comply with our air quality laws. And DEQ's implementing regulations require that an applicant, quote, submit all information necessary to perform any analysis or make any determination required for that air quality analysis. So the sentiment being that information doesn't exist because this industry has not provided that information. How can you be assured that it will comply? And then another thing that is important is, as Kate articulated too, Zenith has a really palpable history of bad behavior, and DEQ has the authority under ORS 468.070 to deny a permit based on material misrepresentation and, in summary, failure to comply with their historic permits. So one might argue that that is the case here. Next slide. And this is my last discussion point, but anyone who has been following the Zenith issue for 6 months, 6+ years, knows that there is an issue with what's called the land use compatibility standard, and or the land use compatibility statement. And that is something that is issued by the city of Portland, and it's been denied, and that was a huge victory. And then, XYZ. Now Zenith has a land use compatibility statement. You have to have a Lux to get any sort of DEQ issued permit. And this is, a threshold issue for any sort of DEQ issued permit. And in the Lux, the city articulated that the city or Zenith must stop handling crude oil by 2027. And this requirement is, in a large way, some would argue is good. That's integrated into Zenith's air quality permit. The question is, how is that enforceable? Who gets to enforce that? And if there's questions as to enforceability, I think there are very requisite questions as to, will Zenith be complied or obligated or moved to comply with those conditions? And I think that's something that would be important to raise in these comments is like, yes, you have stated that Zenith must stop handling crude oil by 2027, but who makes sure that happens? And if that's the premise of compliance, that's a really interesting thing to grapple with. So I'm happy to answer any more questions on that. And again, thanks for being here. And hopefully that made a little bit of sense.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate you. There's a lot of info here. And yeah, thank you for doing this. And we're gonna get to come back to Mary for questions. But first, we're going to hear from Bonnie, the wonderful Bonnie.
Hi, everybody. And I'd like to thank Jenny O'Connor for help with editing and formatting the following slides. Next slide, please. If you've been at this a while, you know that a record-breaking number of comments and public hearing testimonies have helped crunch many climate-busting projects over the past dozen years. Written comments and spoken testimony have power. Multiple coal, oil, and gas companies have been denied permits to exist. So let's have another crack at Zenith. Words can change the course of expectations and industrial plans. In the Pacific Northwest, numerous unsound fossil fuel proposals have been derailed by voices of people like you. You do not need to be an attorney, a structural or chemical engineer. You have a unique perspective. Your knowledge, opinions, and experiences are powerful. Get them seen and heard by the public and by decision-making bodies. Next slide, please. I'm sure will have your own writing process, but you'll be writing a draft. In drafting your written comments or oral testimony, you may begin with a list or random thoughts on Zenith. Think about how they connect with your own feelings. Let your ideas flow, then go back and cut unnecessary words. Start over if you don't like it. Think about your own personal angle on the issue. Words will come because this is important to you and important to all inhabitants of these riverlands and skyways. To open, offer thanks for the opportunity to comment or testify. Briefly introduce yourself. Include anything that connects you to the issue. Anything. Maybe you're just safety conscious. Maybe you're a parent, a grandparent, a medical professional, a contented Oregonian, an environmentalist, a kayaker, a volunteer, anything. Any human of any age may submit a comment. Multiple comments are accepted. You could write a comment tonight. You can write a comment tomorrow, the next day, clear until December 16th at 5 p.m. Just make sure that each comment touches on a different aspect of the problems with Zenith. Your comments are public record and anyone may see them. Next slide, please. State your position on the specific issue. You do not need to be an expert, but be familiar with the issue. Talking points will help you with this. Columbia Riverkeeper has excellent talking points for this Zenith air quality permit. This very slideshow that you're watching will soon be available for you to review. You may want to quote someone, an expert, a person who knows the issue firsthand, a child. Be brief and avoid long sentences and big blocks of text. Be firm and respectful. You may be completely exhausted and fed up with Zenith, but remember that you're making a request. Next slide, please. Special considerations for oral testimony. Hope you're making that oral testimony on November 19th or on December 4th. Your thoughtful words may move others to comment or become active or join a group or talk with their circles about Zenith and the CEI hub. Your comments and testimony can cause ripples and inspire others. Practice and practice and practice and time your testimony. Build confidence by asking a friend to hear it, even if it's over the phone. Be prepared in advance to cut your testimony down. Often we're told that we have 3 minutes to testify, but by the time the hearing actually starts, there may be too many people in the room and they'll cut our testimony time to 2, perhaps 1 minute. So look at your testimony, think of what sections could be removed if necessary to maintain your points. When giving oral testimony, you can read directly from your document or glance at your notes. Nothing is wrong with reading directly from your well-prepared testimony. Next slide, please. Your speaking out is an achievement. Your words will inspire the community. Thank you for your time, your effort, and your courage. And if you do come to the November 19th rally and hearing, please wear red, universal color of fossil fuel resistance.
Yay! I love it. So true, Bonnie. I'm inspired. Okay, let's open it up for some questions. And let's try, we only have 10 minutes. So I'll please ask you to ask a question and not make an announcement. And yeah, if you could use the raise your hand feature, that will help me be able to see who's next because I'm screen sharing and can't see everyone's little cute face. So I see Kathy has a hand up. You want to start us off?
Yeah, I have a question for Mary. Can you give some specifics about their failure to comply with the historic permits? One or two.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll drop the link in the chat, but Kate has done a really fantastic job and has made that publicly accessible on CRK's website of their timeline of violations. And I'll drop that in the chat, and that's a great thing to reference. Kate can speak more to it, but
Okay.
they have not been complying.
Yeah, I just loaded the chat up with a bunch of links to different resources, and the one that Mary's referring to is the Legacy of Violations and Lies. There's a number of different types of violations. They range from failure to submit their paperwork for, starting construction, completing construction, things like that, to things that are way more concerning, like they stored volatile fuels in fixed roof tanks, and they're meant to be stored in floating roof tanks to reduce the risk of harm in a number of ways. And they were storing the wrong type of fuels in fixed roof tanks. And then the violation we talked about, which was pretty shocking, where they expanded their fossil fuel facility illegally to incorporate the McCall oil dock.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary and Kate. Next we have Allie.
Hey, so I'll be there to submit the oral testimony and show up for everybody. Is there a place that we should do written testimony too, or or should I just do it there?
Great question. Yes, so I think one of the links that Kate dropped in the chat is there's a petition you can sign, and that will take you to a page that our coalition is using to gather comments online. And there's a place, you're basically signing on to some like sample text that we've already put together as a coalition, and then you have the opportunity to add your own personalization in the comment box. So you can do it like that. We can also drop in the chat the mailing address. Some people like to mail in like handwritten comments or drawings or we can be creative here. And the email address if you want to just send like something via email directly. We didn't mention this, but we will be doing like an actual delivery of all of the handwritten comments we've gathered, not just during this comment period, but over the past like 7 years. We will be delivering them the final day that the comment period is open on the 16th. So you can also hand deliver it with us that day, and there's more to come on that.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. How about Joan?
Hi there. So since Zenith is a storage facility and the permit is theoretically regulating emissions from stationary sources, how do we ask them about the fact that there are releases of there's the releases during movement of fuels, like from the train to the pipes, from the pipes to the storage facility. I mean, there's fugitive emissions happening even from the trains, but the permit can't address any of that, even though that's what Zenith is very much involved in. Like when the trains roll up and the stuff is going to be put down into the pipes, but they have to open up the top vent to off gas, and you could smell it out in the air. but this permit isn't supposed to address that because that's considered a mobile source rather than a stationary source. Is anybody addressing that, or do I have it all wrong?
Who wants to take that one?
Kate, I'll let you have first dibs, but if you don't want to take it, I have a underwhelming
Go ahead with your
response.
thought, and
Okay.
I'll do cleanup hitting.
Yeah, we can't, unfortunately, at this time, regulate what's called a mobile source. So the exact scenario that you're talking about is a profound issue, but this specific comment, and frankly, any other permit that DEQ would issue, is not going to be sufficiently protective for exactly what you're talking about, which is one of the multitude of reasons why we cannot authorize this production, because there's nothing to regulate that I am aware of. But that is why we can connect the articulated emissions profiles that we kind of discussed today and that are, fleshed out throughout the draft permit to, real life health impacts. But yeah, Kate, what do you have to add? And great question.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Mary. And I think that's, one of the issues about Zenith is that they're in the business of storage and transloading. So they never actually own the product that's moving through their facility. And a lot of the regulatory language that we see is directed around fuels that are purchased and sold in the states. Technically, that captures everything, right? But the loophole for Zenith is that when it comes to liability, their liability is so limited that it's only the things that are directly at their site address. So even though they're profiting from bringing in this huge increase in throughput, and we're talking about 5.5 times the throughput that it was in 2019 when they assured DEQ there wouldn't be more throughput. So we're talking about just under so I think it would be like in the 900 million gallons annually. That's like roughly, more than, if it's all on trains, that's more than 300 unit trains per year. We're talking about almost a train a day. So it's a huge increase in the risk and the danger all the way on both sides, like upstream and downstream. But what Zenith is doing is claiming this little amount of liability, but they also are claiming all of the downstream benefits at the point of combustion, right? Like, oh, we're reducing all this, particulate matter and things like that with renewable diesel. It's like, well, what about the upstream effects and all the harm that's being done upstream? So that's really frustrating, and it is a big loophole for companies that are in the business of storage and transport. That's something that we're also definitely need to push to have that included in the regulatory language.
But it's the permit that DEQ is implementing. Is that permit written by a Oregon law? I mean, why is it? I'm not talking about upstream or downstream. I'm talking about right at the Zenith facility. If there's off-gassing going on there during the mobile, I mean, things are moving. So it isn't stationary. So, but the permit is saying we can't regulate that. But is that permit written by DEQ, or is that a statute? Who designed the permit?
I can take this. Yes, to all. So the statute is the Federal Clean Air Act that only regulates what we described as stationary sources, so not a moving train. Under the Clean Air Act, EPA allows for a state agency to be delegated to basically carry out their federal authority through the issuance of permits. So EPA in theory would be able to do this, but then DEQ in Oregon, they get the authorization to carry that out. So it's DEQ's permits that's implementing federal law, and DEQ also articulates state regulations that are supposed to match the federal law. Does that make sense?
It does. And was Title V also only stationary?
Title V is also only stationary. We have no mechanism in this state to regulate anything that's not a stationary source. And a stationary source, for those, a good way to think about it is a facility. Yeah, Well, that would not be a stationary source, which
Right.
is horrifying, right? Yeah, because that's such a huge source of pollution. A stationary source is, think a factory with a big stack emitting. That's a stationary source. Things like a train or a truck are not. And I am not agreeing with you that, all right, I do agree with you that that is completely insufficient for regulating air quality, but the Clean Air Act only authorizes regulation of stationary sources.
So it's not
Mm.
worth bringing it up during testimony. Thanks.
I mean, one thing to note too, when we're talking about regulation is that, you know, when Zenith was negotiating its permits with the city, they did agree to a definition of renewable fuels
Right.
that required it to contain 95% or more renewable fuels, meaning 5% or less conventional fuels. That's the opposite ratio that the state and federal requirements. So the state and federal requirements currently say you can have 95%, say diesel, for example, you add in 5% renewable, you can call it renewable. But it's a really different product than when you have 95% renewable and you add in 5% conventional. So the benefits, the, you know, emissions and things like that are different. And one of the problems is that it's not clear whether DEQ is going to actually even, I mean, I didn't see it explicitly written in the draft air permit that DEQ is going to regulate and enforce Zenith at the requirement of 95% renewable when the rest of the state they're enforcing at 5% renewable. And so what that would mean is if DEQ is not enforcing it, that enforcement and regulation would fall to the city of Portland, who has shown no evidence that they have capacity to regulate that, shouldn't set a precedent for other facilities to have special conditions that are fallen on the city to regulate. And I'm not sure how they would do it because DEQ doesn't even get their data until, you know, February about the products going through the facility and how much there were. So that's a big concern. So you can mention that, like whether, you know, the state is going to be regulating the requirement to have this higher level of renewable fuels, or if they're going to put that on the city.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Joan. Really important points to raise. Nikki.
Hi, thank you all. This is really great. In terms of writing the testimony, I just have a question about this issue we are just talking about, Dineen, about the ability to enforce. And also I want to kind of raise both the ability to enforce and ability to comply in terms of Zenith's ability or unwillingness likely to comply. Because as I recall from the public information hearing, DEQ is being pretty clear that they don't really care. And that they really don't care if they can't enforce it, or they really aren't going to pay attention to the fact that Zenith has violated all these things in the past. And the reason I'm raising that is hopefully I misunderstood that or something, but if I didn't, what would you recommend in terms of writing comments that they don't just discount what I think they've already discounted as an argument to deny the permit?
I mean, I think it's a good question. I don't know if this is the right advice, but I'll tell you my feelings on it are that I don't feel like we should be limited by what DEQ tells us their limitations are. Like we talked about, I think we need to push DEQ to step into that space where they're pushing up against the edges of their authority, which they haven't done yet. We need them to honor their mission to protect and restore the quality of the air, land, and water, right? And that does include permitting some levels of pollution, but it doesn't require them to say yes to every bad project, right? And we really need them to, if they want to start, you know, evolving their permitting, that they need to be stepping into that space and evolving the protection, which is really what their job is. So I would encourage folks to, yes, focus on the things that Mary identified, but also, you know, DEQ needs to hear all of this. Like, we need to let them know about all of this. And also, they're not the only ones listening. And I want to be clear too, we're going to give everything we can to DEQ in this comment period, but DEQ is not the end of the road. It wouldn't be like a shocker if DEQ approved this permit, right? But that is not where we stop fighting against Zenith. Okay, so we will continue to have pathways for opposition. So I don't want anybody to feel like we don't have things still lined up. Okay, so just be aware of that. But I think that in that, as I mentioned, that like DEQ is not going to be the only one listening to these comments. So we need to inform them about everything, but also there's going to be other decision makers listening to these comments. And I think it's important for them to hear it all too.
Yeah, whenever I'm trying to write comments for a fundamentally bad idea, I think about like, okay, so this is the framework that we're working in this case, you know, the Clean Air Act. I articulate why my concerns are relevant to that specific thing. And then I always say, and while I've got you here, these are the other, you know, 40, 50,000 reasons that this is a bad idea. And it all falls under the purview of DEQ because it's a public health issue and it's an environmental quality issue. So don't be afraid, as Kate articulated, to put it all out in writing or in your testimony. Bringing it back to DEQ specific authority is helpful for when they try to say, oh, well, that's like not our problem, because yes, it is. And two, it's also your problem because of all of these other reasons. So I always kind of take the yes, and while I've got you here approach.
Perfect. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Nikki. And I think our final question for the evening from Leslie.
Yeah, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, this is kind of related to what we've been talking about, and it's just this issue of all these other impacts that DEQ says they don't have the authority to address. The, you know, all the shipping by trains and ships and trucks and offloading off their site. And I'm just wondering how they've argued that those other emissions, which are really, or potential spills, et cetera, which are really part of Zenith's life cycle potential impacts, how are they arguing that others are looking at those issues and regulating those issues? And if there's something that you can just send me to that's useful to look at, that would be great, because I know we've gone past the time, but I just feel like that's another, that just bothers me so much, that that all these things are looked at in these piecemeal ways, which keep us stymied in terms of what we have to comment on and what we have to demand different entities are taking responsibility for.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's exactly right. I think, you know, I've said the same thing to anyone at DEQ who will listen, right? It's like the public is calling this out for what it is. You're taking these little different pieces and going, oh, we're only looking at this piece and someone else is looking at this piece. And what we hear basically, and we hear it inside of DEQ, we also hear it from agency to agency, that it's not our job to protect the public from this. It's someone else's job. And I've said, you know, and you're right on that, like, if you were to step back and look at this project in its entirety, the decision becomes much more clear, right? It's the same thing that's happening just downstream near Port Westward with the next renewables, right? Where they're trying to put this huge refinery in, and it's just been, the permits have been just divvied up into these little different sections to make it look like the impact is not as significant as it is. And when you look at it as a whole, it's just like outrageously alarming what they're trying to do. And frankly, like in that context of, you know, Oregon having these, you know, state goals to reduce greenhouse gases and things like that, while DEQ right now between the next facility and Zenith is posed to potentially permit over, you know, 1 million tons of greenhouse gases a year, right? That wasn't there before. So what did I say?
So
100 million. Yeah. And so, you know, that's concerning. Like, how is that in line with our state goals? So yeah.
So in terms of making that argument, do we have some good information on how those other entities, those other, points of potential risk are or are not regulated?
I'm gonna
Have
kick that
we
to Mary.
have we been specific about that before in our comments?
Yeah,
Does
that's a
that
really good
question make
question.
sense?
No, it makes sense, and you are again articulating a huge gap in our regulatory system. So I think that's a good thing to raise is kind of going off in the comment chats is the next facility, and as Kate has articulated, like this is all one big piece of locking Oregon into this renewable fuels misnomer of climate resiliency, and taking this opportunity to say we should not be taking this piecemeal approach, because one, we have the empirical evidence that it is not going to solve our climate change issues, and there are so many associated risks that have not been sufficiently studied. And by locking this infrastructure in now, we are locking in an exposure to these risks for generations. And I always liken it to what we've done with dams in the Pacific Northwest. And we are now, however many years later, being like, oh my God, maybe this was a bad idea. Yeah, it's a bad idea. So let's talk about it now. And just because that the regulatory structures aren't in place to implicate a legal obligation doesn't mean that we as citizens don't have the obligation to raise those issues on paper and get the discussion going.
Right, thanks.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, what Sabrina raised in the chat of like, given the federal election results, now more than ever, like this needs to be solidified ASAP on the state level, because of the uncertainty and just terribleness that will come from the EPA for the next 4 years. I think that's a very relevant thing to include in your comments, and I would like to hope that that DEQ staff would be sympathetic to that. Yeah. And I feel like when we talk about this, it's easy to kind of feel frustrated. This is like extremely frustrating to hear how piecemeal these agencies are, and it's like almost as if this system was like designed for industry to succeed and not for the people, and that sucks. And DEQ has been on our side throughout the work that many of us here have been a part of over the past decade. They were on our side with stopping Jordan Cove. So I don't it's not a lost cause, like we've moved them before as an agency, and I don't think we would be here tonight if we thought that there was like no hope at all. There really there is, and as Kate mentioned too, like there will be many other levels of government there listening. Yeah, I think we're now like 15 minutes over, so thank you so much for everyone's time this evening, and a special thank you to Kate and Mary and Bonnie, and just to all of you for being here and for your great questions that led to some really thoughtful conversation. Your questions and your love in the chat. I can't wait to be wearing red with you all on Tuesday. Should we all unmute and do a little cheer?
Yay.
Spread the word. Bring your friends and your dogs.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, presenters.
Thanks,
Thank
y'all.
you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Let's go get them.
Yeah.
Woohoo! Do your best.